What a nice introduction. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming and spending part of your afternoon with me. I appreciate it. My topic, Healing in the History of Christianity, is preceded with the question, good news, ? Christianity is the most popular religion in the world. 1/3 of all people living on the planet today, an estimated 2.1 billion, identify as Christian. As everyone here well knows, Christianity has been a major force in the long history of European civilizations. It has also shaped ideas about discovery and settlement in the Americas, and continues to play a major role in the cultural histories of many nations, not least of which is the United States. Christianity sustains many religious communities in the world today and drives new community formation, most remarkably in the Southern Hemisphere. A key factor in the massive and long-term success of this religious tradition is healing. From the earliest stories about Jesus to global enthusiasm for Pentecostalism today, claims, concerns, and rituals associated with healing have attracted an astonishing number of people. Now I have to tell you a little story. My wonderful husband read an earlier draft of this, and in the margins after this last sentence, it had previously read that healing had attracted a staggering number of Christians. And he wrote in the margin a number of staggering Christians. No more sick jokes, I promise. I want to begin by acknowledging the diversity of this tradition, a consequence not only of its longevity and geographic reach, but also of its adaptation to local cultures and capacity to reform in response to larger trends in science, market economies, and new forms of media communication. Without losing touch with the protean aspect of Christian history, I want to zero in this afternoon on several major landmarks in the history of Christian healing, turning points that highlight the role healing has played in the history of Christianity's extraordinary success. I speak to you not as a theologian or an ethicist seeking normative clarity, but as a historian interested in how religion mediates change over time. In reflecting on how powerfully the vast, culturally diverse tradition of Christianity has moved through time, I want to highlight problems that have arisen as a result of its popular success as a religion of healing, and especially the role that competition has played. My thesis is that adaptations stimulated by competition in the arena of healing, by problems associated with that competition, have opened opportunities for Christianity's ongoing and even increasing popularity. Over 20 centuries, Christians have had in common some kind of identification with Jesus of Nazareth, and we should begin with him. The earliest and presumably most authentic descriptions of Jesus reveal an arresting figure who expelled demons in a simple, forceful manner. Mark opens his account of the work of Jesus with the exorcism at Capernaum. At the synagogue there, a man possessed by an unclean spirit confronted Jesus, saying, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus commanded, "Be muzzled and come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed the man and came out, and the people were amazed. A second exorcism occurs later in Mark's story in a mountainous region of Galilee, where Jesus met another possessed man, wandering, crying out, and bruising himself with stones. Jesus commands, "Come out, unclean spirit," and in response, the man kneels, crying out with a loud voice, "I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Jesus demands the demon's name, which is Legion, and performs the exorcism. Legion retreats in a herd of pigs. As foundational elements of Jesus' reputation as a healer and miracle worker, these accounts of exorcism provided a base for the gospel writers' lessons about faith and discipleship. In addition to serving as points of departure for moral instruction, the accounts of exorcism posed problems, or at least questions to be answered. How did the power wielded by Jesus differ from the power of demons? And what set Jesus apart from other miracle workers? Efforts to answer these questions and to stabilize the problem of Jesus' unsettled identity spurred the development of the religion centered on him. Jesus' ignominious death as a criminal was an even greater stumbling block to faith than questions of identity. But the crucifixion was also a dilemma upon which the followers of Jesus exercised their imaginations in ways that galvanized the development of Christian healing. Instead of putting an end to his fame as a healer and miracle worker, the crucifixion became the basis of Christianity's reputation as a religion attentive to human suffering. Although many early theologians did not believe that Jesus Christ had actually allowed himself to suffer, claims about his victory over suffering and death stimulated Christianity's early growth, motivating growing numbers of followers to seek out suffering and death to test the strength of their faith. In inspiring such spiritual athleticism, efforts to resolve the problems of Jesus' apparent loss of power in ignominious death shaped the early practice of Christianity as a healing cult. And the response that he had conquered death was more than just a claim. In baptismal rites, initiates sealed their identity as members of Christ's body by surrendering themselves and taking on his invincibility, passing through the waters of future death, and emerging restored to new life and strength in Christ. Participants also enacted their membership in Christ's spiritual body through common meals, moral instruction, and by casting out demons and attending to disease and injury. In the early centuries of the growing Jesus movement, men and women embodying the healing power of Christ fanned out into the ancient Mediterranean world. These Christian healers competed effectively in an uncontrolled healthcare market, gaining adherents who could not afford the costs involved in therapies for elite customers, like those admitted to the healing cults of Isis, or who were not able to travel to the temples of Asclepius. In urban areas during epidemics, Christians who remained to nurse the sick and tend the dead, rather than fleeing to the countryside, as many did who could afford to, attracted admirers, as did the immunity from disease some of these spiritual athletes seem to have acquired. In desert regions of Syria and Egypt, Christian ascetics channeled Christ's healing power, and people sought them out. Legends of cures performed by these miracle workers enhanced Christianity's popular appeal. Constantine's Edict of Toleration in 313 had brought an end to the persecution of Christians, and Theodosius's recognition of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 381 expedited the religion's growth, status, and power. But imperial acceptance and the increased popularity it brought were not unmitigated good news. They also created a new dilemma. Spiritual purists, leery of entanglements with worldly powers, resisted equations of Christianity with imperial authority. And with the end of persecution, martyrdom in its early form of victimization by the state had to be transformed. Stories about the great martyrs of the past flourished, and Christians enamored of spiritual prowess became martyrs to their own sinful flesh. The development of Christian philanthropy in late antiquity was also a response to the problem posed by Christianity's loss of marginal status as a persecuted religion. Employing bureaucratic resources newly available to Christians as a result of their imperial connections, Christian bishops maintained continuity with the healing cult of early Christianity through organized outreach to the sick and poor. Hospitals were a Christian invention, where Christian physicians utilized pagan Greek diagnostic methods and medical remedies in institutions designed not only to care for sick people, but also to treat specific medical ailments. Hospitals enabled Christian caregivers to hone their humility, compassion, and spiritual fortitude, as well as their medical abilities. Thus, in 4th century Caesarea, the Cappadocian physician and church father Basil greeted his patients with a kiss before attending to his medical diagnosis of their complaints. Monasteries planted all over medieval Europe served as pilgrimage sites where the dismembered body parts of early martyrs believed to possess healing powers were relocated. Monasteries also served as infirmaries and outpatient clinics where monks with handbooks of Greek medicine and apothecary collections of roots and herbs tended patients. In these settings, medical treatment and religious practice coexisted, and chaplains might refer penitents to the clinic, while monks in the clinic might refer patients to the chapel. But competition between faith and medicine was ever present, and this competition posed the problem of how to maintain the superiority of faith in relation to medicine while defining faith in a way that accommodated medicine. Christian writers insisted strenuously on the superiority of Christ's healing power, especially when the medical providers were Jews or pagans, but also when Christian practitioners of medicine sought footholds of independence from Christian authority. Thus, bishops kept a watchful eye on medical practitioners in their own religious ranks, and as an indication of what they were up against, prohibited monks from establishing separate revenue streams for medicine. In other words, Christians responded to the competition between faith and medicine not by stomping medicine out, but by sponsoring and managing it, insisting on the superiority of faith while taking advantage of the benefits of medicine. Competing forms of miraculous healing posed a similar problem for medieval Christians, who turned this problem into an advantage by transforming pagan deities into saints and taking over local healing cults. Sacred springs known to locals for their healing waters became venues for the creation of monasteries and pilgrimage sites where the relics of martyred saints were transported and rehoused. The rich fusion of Christianity and indigenous custom enabled Christianity's growth throughout medieval Europe and produced an extraordinary flourishing of visual art and architecture that still dazzles the mind. Christianity shaped the culture of medieval Europe by embracing and reconstructing local customs, especially those associated with medicine and healing, and by influencing the development of market economies. Travel to and from pilgrimage sites, typically for purposes of healing, stimulated markets for all kinds of locally produced goods around those sites and along the roads, from cheese, ale, and aprons to amulets and candles. Christian authorities exerted some control over the development of this trade, as they did over political and military affairs. The commercialism of medieval Christianity, stimulated in no small part by its reputation for healing, created a new kind of problem. Strong criticism emerged regarding profits accrued from selling religious merchandise, prayers for the dead, magical thinking about relics, holy water, and the ringing of bells, all of which exploited poor people's vulnerability to superstition and led to the church's extraordinary wealth and worldly splendor. Fed up with the avarice and what he perceived as moral decline in the priesthood, the 12th century Cistercian Bernard of Clairvaux complained that wooden priests with golden chalices had replaced golden priests with wooden chalices of old. And he was only one of many Christian leaders in the late Middle Ages who lamented what he perceived as the church's loss of spiritual purity. Here again, a problem created through Christianity's success as a religion of healing would prompt efforts to resolve that problem, which in turn led to new developments. As has so often been the case in the history of Christianity, the introduction of important new elements into Christianity occurred in the context of attempts to reawaken earlier forms of spiritual purity and power. Seeking to recover the purity of primitive Christianity, Bernard and other reformers introduced a new form of mysticism dedicated to the cultivation of feelings of suffering as means of emulating Christ and union with God. Not surprisingly, this mystical celebration of suffering has had special attraction for women who could compete on the playing field of suffering as they could rarely compete in learning or office. Bernard himself took special interest in women's spirituality and tutored several women who became famous for incorporating his teachings about the suffering humanity of Jesus and Mary, and for embodying his instructions about the power of suffering as a means of mystical union with God. Grassroots communities of lay women, often known as beguines, helped to popularize this mysticism. Propelled by their quest to identify with the sufferings of Jesus and Mary, lay mystics created new initiatives in urban outreach to the sick and dying. Like Bernard 4 centuries earlier and many reformers in between, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other Protestant reformers in the 16th century were offended by the materialism of Christianity and by what they perceived as the misuse of Christian prayer and repentance for purposes of healing and prosperity. Eager to separate the true spirit of Christianity from efforts to derive personal benefit, Calvin tried to stop people from praying for relief from sickness and demanded that they focus on glorifying God instead. For Calvin, suffering was an opportunity to contemplate one's sins, repent, and beg God for mercy on one's soul, with gratitude for the suffering God used to bring repentance about. It demeaned God's greatness, Calvin believed, to petition him as if he were someone to be persuaded or bargained with or even manipulated. Christian life was about constant awareness of dependence on God and about how one acted as an instrument of God in community with other Christians. In some respects, similar to this spiritual athleticism of early Christians, Calvinists gloried in the exercise of their faith and welcomed suffering spiritual trials that tested their fortitude and brought them closer to God. But unlike earlier Christians, Calvinists attempted to dispense with miraculous signs. Their attempts to achieve spiritual purity by separating religion from miracles contributed to modernizing forces that evacuated God from the material world and from bodily suffering, except as God could be seen upholding the world and its suffering by those with eyes to see. Of course, Christianity had always depended on people with faith. But in the modern era, the choice of faith in God was more individualized, and more detachable from medicine and science than before. The choice not to see God would even come to draw support from science. The idea that a great scientific revolution took place in the 17th century is often challenged, because discoveries made by Isaac Newton and William Harvey built on earlier foundations, and their approach to knowledge was more like that of their medieval predecessors than of scientists today. Nevertheless, a rhetoric extolling scientific breakthroughs did command attention in the 17th century. In 1623, Francis Bacon declared that men of science had moved beyond imposing inaccurate pictures onto material reality and had finally begun to discover the seal of God on things. 17th century Christians came to inhabit material worlds whose operations were being studied with fewer restraints than before, partly because Protestants were confident that God was ultimately in control of everything, and that no journey of exploration or anatomical discovery could be made except according to his providence. Ironically, Protestants disturbed by the materialism of Christianity and its reputation for healing miracles opened the way for scientific medicine to become more competitive, not only as a source of healing, but as an arbiter of what healing was. The days of dual revenue streams from chapel and infirmary under church control were passing. The growing effectiveness of scientific medicine caused this change. To take just one example of how ineffective medicine was before the latter part of the 19th century, when George Washington complained of a sore throat in 1799, probably from pneumonia, he received the best treatment available. As one medical historian described it, he was given a mixture of molasses, vinegar, butter, and then made to vomit and have diarrhea. But he lapsed. In desperation, his physicians applied irritating poultices to blister his feet and throat while draining several pints of blood. Then he died. A century later, the power relationship between medicine and Christianity had changed, as new developments in modern science transformed the practice of medicine, enabling practitioners to better understand the nature and causes of disease and consequently to treat disease more effectively. Though Christianity and medicine continued to draw on each other for mutual support, clerical authority waned as medical authority waxed. The priests got less powerful and the doctors got more powerful. To take just one example of this dynamic, at the famous shrine at Lourdes, erected on the spot where Mary appeared to the peasant Bernadette in 1858, an Episcopal Commission of Inquiry established by the Catholic Church passed judgment on the authenticity of healing claims presented to it for approval. In 1883, that responsibility passed to a medical bureau that included clerical advisors. Subsequently, as the focus shifted further to medical criteria for validating a cure, ecclesiastical certifications of miracles at Lourdes simply disappeared. For researchers engaged in scientific investigation, the growing effectiveness of scientific medicine also coincided with the growing irrelevancy of expecting to find the seal of God on things. Ironically, discoveries made possible by confidence that the hand of God would be revealed as nature gave up her secrets prompted questions about the origin and evolution of the world that challenged the very idea of divine creation. The explanatory power of new discoveries, their countless applications in new products and technologies, and not least their effectiveness in treating disease, created new problems and new opportunities for Christians. Some Christians responded to advances in human biology, disease treatment, and pain management by eschewing medical materialism and insisting on the efficacy of spiritual diagnosis and treatment. In one sense, exclusive reliance on divine power in healing was nothing new. Medieval writers sometimes recommended such a radical course. But the consequences of rejecting medical therapies became more dire when medicine became more effective and authoritative. Even in the United States, where religion is widely embraced and taken very seriously, the state will punish parents who prevent seriously ill children from receiving medical treatment for religious reasons. Legal cases involving Christian scientists committed exclusively to divine healing have been the most commonly prosecuted, perhaps as a result of the high visibility of Christian scientists as white middle-class Americans who should know better, at least according to society at large. A clear indication of Christianity's loss of status compared with medicine, U.S. courts have prosecuted scores of Christian scientists who refused medical treatment for children or failed to seek it when medicine might have saved them. On the other hand, many other Christians took new developments in medicine in stride, altering their conceptions of Christian ministry with little hesitation. From the late 19th century on, medical work became an increasingly important arm of Christian philanthropy. Medical missions flourished in many parts of the world, and Protestant missionaries like William Lockhart and Albert Schweitzer introduced modern medical facilities where there were none before in China and Africa. Already by 1900, 650 Protestant physicians worked as medical missionaries in various parts of the world, and many of them worked in clinics and hospitals independent of clerical supervision. In these contexts, Christ was no longer in charge of healing in the same way he had been presumed to be in charge in medieval monasteries or ancient hospitals. Prayer and other forms of worship would still be encouraged as a supplement to medicine or something that one did when one was healed or when medicine didn't work. But the relationship between the power of Christ and the power of medicine had shifted. This realignment in the relationship between spiritual healing and medical attention has created a cluster of problems that Christians are now working to resolve. Recent studies of the placebo effect offer insight into the difficulties this shift has created and into the ways some believers are reformulating Christianity in response. Placebo is an old term, long used in Western medicine to describe the administration of inert substances, like the talcum powder used for centuries by ship's doctors to calm patients who suffered injuries. Beginning with medical trials for new pharmaceuticals in the mid-20th century, scientists began to isolate and measure placebo effects and explain how they work. Today, there is general agreement that placebos reduce stress caused by fear. One line of recent medical research focuses on the biological mechanisms of placebo effects and how placebo effects operate in different systems of the body. Another line of research focuses on the social environments in which placebos are delivered and on the layers of cultural meaning within which placebos operate and facilitate relief from fear. Some proponents of Christian healthcare have enthusiastically embraced the idea that Christianity might operate as a placebo effect, celebrating research on the placebo effect as a new justification for maintaining Christian involvement in medicine, and as one more reason to motivate people to pray and attend church. Harold Koenig, co-director of the Center for Spirituality, Theology, and Health at Duke University Medical Center, promotes the benefits of devout religious practice for health and longevity. Though he believes that people should turn to religion for what he calls intrinsic reasons, he is eager to point out the happy side effects. Devout religious people, he argues, and this is a quote from Koenig, quote, cope with stress better. They experience greater well-being because they have more hope. They're more optimistic. They experience less depression, less anxiety, and they commit suicide less often. They don't drink alcohol as much. they don't use drugs as much, they don't smoke cigarettes as much, and they have healthier lifestyles. They have stronger immune systems, lower blood pressure, probably better cardiovascular functioning, and probably a healthier hormonal environment physiologically, particularly with respect to cortisol and adrenal stress hormones. And they live longer. Other researchers have challenged some of these sweeping claims, questioned the validity of many of the numerous studies claiming to show the beneficial effects of prayer, and called attention to the possibility that religious activity might also induce as well as alleviate fear. There is also the question of how to distinguish the placebo effects of one religion from another, and of how to distinguish the placebo effects of any religion from athletic activity, club membership, or an optimistic personality. No studies have isolated the placebo effects from other coping mechanisms, social conditions, and genetic markers, because it is difficult, if not impossible, to separate religion out in this way. Some researchers have also raised concerns about the use of such claims as a way of proselytizing, arguing that patients should not be subjected to emotional coercion to become religious, and that Koenig's work invites Christian caregivers to harass patients and violate their rights. Aside from discussion of the medical ethics of promoting Christian practice as an aid to recovery from heart surgery or gastrointestinal disease, the fact remains that Christian healing can be conceptualized and is being conceptualized as a placebo effect, with the result that human biology and its evolution have become the context for understanding and indeed promoting Christian healing. Recent work on the placebo effect provides a basis for taking claims to Christian healing seriously. We know that placebos do have biological effects. And it is one more example of Christianity's adaptability to new circumstances, in this case, the circumstance of the authority of medical materialism. Acceptance of research on the placebo effect as a way of understanding and promoting Christianity puts new pressure on Christianity and its reputation for healing. Recovery and health become standards against which Christian practices can be measured and improved, with the implication that Christianity is good because it promotes recovery and health, and ought to be reformed if it detracts from them. What if other practices work more effectively? What if yoga, bird watching, or time on Facebook work just as reliably? What if guilt or sin consciousness as part of Christian practice could be shown to create stress and compromise the immune system? These questions might lead to innovations that improve Christian healing and lower boundaries with respect to other cultural traditions. Christian yoga may be just around the corner if it's not already here. If we follow out the line of thought I have been developing this afternoon, that problems arising through the success of Christian healing have inspired creative solutions, we can observe the pressure that new discoveries about health and recovery exert on Christianity, and the ingenuity with which promoters of Christian healing respond. In a culture with a ubiquitous and diverse healthcare market like ours, it is not a coincidence that popular preachers and Christian writers like Max Lucado and T.D. Jakes emphasize the salutary effects of Christian life and soft-pedal guilt and suffering to the extent that Christians in previous times did not. This is not to say that Lucado and Jakes are inattentive to suffering, but rather that they understand that a market flooded with healing services and products to prevent suffering defines the turf on which they compete. We might wonder if this competition might be a reason they do not engage medical health care policies. Lucado's new book, titled Fearless, Imagine Your Life Without Fear, is an excellent example of how common knowledge that stress has ill effects has led to new ways of promoting prayer and other Christian practices as means of relieving stress. Aware that medical researchers have identified fear as the most basic psychological ingredient in stress, Lucado writes, "If you could hover a fear magnet over your heart and extract every last shaving of dread, insecurity, and doubt, what would remain? Envision a day, just one day, when you could trust more and fear less. Can you imagine your life without fear?" Lucado offers evangelical Christianity as the means to a life without fear, a mental health care choice that he would claim rivals all competition. Spiritual healing is available everywhere today, and not only in places where medicine is unavailable or too costly for people to afford, but also as part of the diverse healthcare market in which affluent and poor people participate. In this context, the recent line of placebo research that focuses on the biological mechanisms and how placebo effects operate in different systems of the body offers a new scientific platform for those who proclaim the supernatural agency of Christ's healing power. When medical biologists like Fabrizio Benedetti locate the cause of placebo effects in the conscious and unconscious psychosocial contexts in which the brain operates, promoters of healing power of faith like Max Lucado find God to be the divine agent operating through Christian life. Other forces are at work as well, reshaping the meaning and practice of Christian healing, creating epistemological and ethical problems for Christians, but also opportunities for reevaluation and revitalization. Coinciding with the transformation in Christianity's relationship with medicine in the 19th century, cultural theories of religion awakened many Christians to the social functions of religion, drawing attention to the ways religious practice enlisted people in social structures that marginalized or exploited them, or marginalized or exploited others. While this type of analysis focused on social order, hierarchy, and injustice, rather than on illness, it brought attention to the social causes of suffering and broadened the context in which Christians conceptualized healing. In the second half of the 20th century, historians of Christianity paid considerable attention to the way Christianity operated in different times and places and as an agent of collective racism and misogyny, or as a means of empowering persecuted groups. This analytical work broadened and transformed understanding of the meaning of Christian suffering, exposing problems in the history of Christianity that participants had long overlooked or suppressed. It also led to new understanding and new motivation for Christian healing. While this social analysis of Christian belief and practice met with resistance, it challenged the belief that sin was essentially personal and offered an understanding of sin as a social phenomenon as well, meaning that individuals might have the purest intentions and personal habits while supporting sinful systems of social oppression. In light of this kind of thinking, Christian healing acquired new meaning. Martin Luther King imagined healing as black children and white children growing up together as equals in America. Desmond Tutu took healing to mean reconciliation after apartheid was legally abolished in South Africa. Environmental Christians would extend the social interpretation of healing even further to include efforts to remedy deforestation, pollution, and species reduction, invoking biblical tropes of the divine blessings of natural fertility and abundance as powerful metaphors of healing. Meanwhile, exorcisms that hearken back to Jesus are more prolific than ever before, especially in Africa, where Christianity combines with indigenous traditions to create new prophets and healing cults. In some ways, the upsurge today in dramatic performances of Christian healing is reminiscent of the proliferation of healing sites in medieval Europe, when encounters with indigenous practices stimulated the growth of Christian healing. But the indigenization of Christian healing today operates in the context of modern scientific materialism and technology, global communication, and control of regional markets by global corporations. Exorcism and spiritual healing now take place in a fragmented postmodern world of virtual realities, as does the competition between spiritual healing and medicine. People still invest in exorcism, but now it marks them politically, economically, or aesthetically as excluded or apart. Consider the situation in Haiti, where indigenized forms of Christian healing have long been prolific and are now called on in the most desperate and earnest ways. The juxtaposition between these religious performances and the medical disaster left by the earthquake that one American doctor flown in compared to the American Civil War is apparent to everyone, as is the lack of a strong infrastructure that would have moderated the disaster and limited the need for so many healing rites. Christian healing in Haiti is good news with a question mark. The same might be said of the connections now being drawn between Christian healing and the placebo effect, or of the social conceptions of healing like those advanced by King and Tutu that transform Christian healing into something new or even into a metaphor for something else. But the history of Christian healing is a history of problems and of adaptations to new situations caused by problems. The fact that the competitive environments in which Christian healing operates have become more daunting than ever before is no indication that it will disappear. Christian healing has always thrived on competition and obstacles to faith. Thank you. Questions, comments, points of confusion? Things to clarify, repeat? Yes, sir.
I didn't understand what is your point on the placebo part? Are you saying that doctors should start using placebo? I don't understand.
Anyone want to jump in to rephrase my point about the placebo effect more clearly than I? Anyone get it? Understand what I was talking about in terms of the placebo effect? No? Yes, please.
Like it basically like the sugar pill thing.
Good. And that it actually can be measured. So it is, there's no question that there are biological effects. And what's the problem with that?
Some people don't want to accept that.
Why not?
They're scientists and they want to be able to make money off of it. You can't make money off of it.
Oh, now that's a point I didn't bring up. Maybe, well, you know, is that true? You can't make money. Well, people do make money off prayers, don't they?
Lady that wrote that book about, I don't remember what it was called, but like if you make this sign for yourself and you think hard enough on it, you're going to do it. And apparently it worked for Nastia Lukin, and she won the gold medal, but that works for everybody.
Okay. And so is this good news with or without a question mark? With a question mark?
Because it means that if, like, Christianity can be used as like a placebo effect, but that means if it fails, then how is Christianity responsible for not working medicine?
Okay. Anything else? Are we satisfying your question?
Perfect.
Okay. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
I have a question in regards to the placebo effect. I think you also made to by certain thinkers among Christians. My question for you is, in your tracing the history of medicine and Christianity, how do you notice the significant change in the relationship between Christianity and preventative medicine? Does or has Christianity had a close connection to preventative medicine? Has big Calvinism posed a challenge to that? And where do we stand now if, in fact, being a Christian essentially can prohibit high blood pressure, heart disease, stressful situations?
Okay. Now, I would just be a little bit cautious about jumping to the conclusion. Some people, like Harold Koenig, maintain that it has that.
Right, assuming LaHaye or whoever else is.
Right, and there are some real questions about the scientific validity of some of those claims. So, okay. So the issue about preventative, well, I think that the real shift is when preventative health becomes imagined in terms of medical materialism. So, we think about preventative health not so much in terms of how empowered you are to feed the poor, but what your metabolism is like and what your cholesterol count is like. So the whole context of how you would think about preventative medicine has shifted to a materialistic model. That's what I want to say. Whereas in earlier times, that probably wasn't the case. People didn't even talk about it that way. Am I answering, or am I understanding what you're saying?
I think my question is, did Christianity have a conception of physical benefit, that one benefited physically from being a Christian earlier? Like you think, for instance, later on, the shift in mentality, like the inoculation issues. Does one accept inoculation or not? Is it seen as a preventative of perhaps God's judgment? And I think it's even, yes, let's stop there.
We're getting into the weeds here. You notice how I've spun over so many centuries here, and now you're forcing me to be really more specific about particular times and places here. I'm not sure I can answer your question. Can anybody help me here? Phil, can you help me on this? Okay. Yeah.
In my own personal belief, I do think that we should get inoculated and stuff like that. But I also believe that we should also hold faith in God that He's going to protect us from some diseases unless it is His will or plan to work through the disease. And maybe even Christian healing as a testament of who He is.
Your sentiments are wonderful. I was looking at more from a historical perspective. In the sense of how have we speaking of Christian traditions in the world, transitioned as you seem to be discussing, view the human body, materialism, the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment understanding of the relationship in body versus one's own agency versus God's agency, how you saw in trends or in that regard. But that may be a little too specific.
Well, no, it's really, I would just come back to this basic point that when you have a world in which spiritual realities, and basically everyone accepts ideal realities as having the energy and the force that construct the world. It's different than when you move into the modern era, especially after the late 19th century, when there are so many things that can be done with a different epistemology that is materialistic, that it puts idealistic thinking on the defensive.
Is that what you mean by saying there's indigenous practices in Africa, and they're the same thing, kind of instead of there's more exorcisms, and I guess exorcisms are more I don't know, indigenous in Africa?
Yes, good, very insightful. That when everybody knows that there are other options out there, exorcism and why you choose exorcism and whether you have a choice, it's not that people are blind to that. So it's now in a context of other choices. And it marginalizes exorcism in a way that exorcism wasn't marginalized before. Thank you. That was very insightful. Yes?
When you talk about the syncretism in Africa, is it mostly like African tribal leaders themselves who are performing or blending these together, or is it missionaries coming to Africa, changing a little bit of it to make it more appealing? Or is it both?
It's both. It's both. And specifically, it's the way in which Christianity has become a fully, is in Africa, and African people are the leaders of it, influenced, maybe not in their generation, in some earlier generation by missionaries from America or from Europe. But now this new kind of Christianity that brings in elements of modern Western Christianity, but now interlaced with indigenous traditions in a way that are recognizable, familiar, and powerful to people. And there are many stories about prophets that have sprung up and different healing cults. Is that responsive to your question, or do you have another question?
I was asking more along the lines of who's more responsible for the blending of both. Like, is it the missionaries coming over from Western cultures, or is it the Africans themselves that are blending these together?
Well, it depends on at what date you're talking. If we're talking about 1848, when Lydia Grout and her husband go to the Zulu, they don't know about Christianity. And so in terms of who has the knowledge of Christianity, it's Lydia Grout and her husband. 20 years later, there are African Christians still under the control, you might say, of the Grouts. But ultimately, the white missionaries are both forced out and back out, and African Christianity is a powerful thing on its own. So it kind of depends on, and so Desmond Tutu, for example, would be a important example of that. So it depends on what time period you look in to see who's really controlling the definition of what Christianity or what religion is. Oh, okay.